I'm Adam. Nice to meet you. Talking about topicality, we're going to start by, first we're going to go over kind of each sub-point that you're going to be talking about, generally step by step. Going to spend a fair amount of time focusing on the standards debate because that's really the crux of the topicality debate. And then we're just going to have a couple examples at the end, or then we'll talk about answering topicality, the structure you want to use for that, and then we'll have examples towards the end to give you a little bit of an idea. But the thing that, like, before we do any of that, the important thing to remember about topicality, I think, is that when you're first learning, there's a lot of jargon, and you're trying to remember each, okay, this goes here, this, and it can be confusing. And don't let the jargon obfuscate the fact that topicality at this point is really a very simple argument, like any other argument in debate. They say one thing, we say another thing, here's why our thing is better. That's what a plan versus counterplan debate is, that's what a interpretation versus counter-interpretation debate is. It's, here's the things that we're saying are different, here's why what we're talking about is better. And always have that thought in mind as you're trying to learn the jargon. Don't let, a lot of times people kind of miss the forest for the trees when they're focusing too much on the hyper-specific meeting, the third sub-point on their violation or something, and they're not producing the very simple, cohesive, here's the distinction between what we're saying, what they're saying, and here's why our version of that is the better one. That's the thing to remember. So I wrote up there just kind of the basic order. It's a little hard to read, but interpretation is generally the A sub-point. And this is, you are saying this is how it should be. This is how we say, how we define the resolution, and what we imagine the plan text should have to do to meet that resolution. So oftentimes it'll be on a word. So if there is, for example, a resolution that the United States federal government should provide humanitarian aid to one or more countries in Africa, then the plan text might give money. And you could have a topicality debate that humanitarian aid must be actual, aid workers or physical goods, and just transferring money to to a different country does not qualify as humanitarian aid. So the interpretation in that example would be, it would be topicality on the word humanitarian aid. The A sub-point is the interpretation that humanitarian aid must be the transfer of either physical goods or aid workers to the affected areas, something along those lines. The more chairs.
I'm done delivering chairs.
The interpretation and the violation go together in a lot of ways. They should be thought of as kind of two sides of the coin. The interpretation is how it should be. The violation is how the plan text does not meet that. So, in that example of humanitarian aid, we say it has to be the transfer of physical goods or actual aid workers going to the affected areas. They only give money. Thus, they don't meet our definition of humanitarian aid. So, that's the setting up of, going back to what I was talking about at the very beginning of the, here's what we're talking about, here's what they're talking about. You want to be as clear as possible on this, and you'll often hear the phrase bright line used, and that's basically, it's trying to clearly as possible delineate the tipping point of anything on this side goes over here, anything on this side goes over here. And the best interpretations will do that very clearly. very difficult to win a topicality debate on words that, like substantially, for example, or significantly. Oh, they're not they're not substantial enough, you know, how they're only do 20% of the budget, we say 25, well, if we did 25, would you have said 30? You know, it's very difficult to win those type of topicality debates generally. Not impossible, but not something that you should be focusing on. Yeah.
This may seem like a silly question,
Those
but
are
if
questions.
someone were talking about, like for an example, the example that you gave, which is great, humanitarian aid, and that could either look in the form of like dollars or physical aid, could someone just like run a perm on it and be like, sure, both, it's all considered humanitarian? Like, could someone do that, or no, because you?
Not really, because essentially what you're saying is topicality is judging whether the plan text as read met the resolution. And so if you are trying to, the reason I'm struggling to explain it is there's kind of a complex theoretical way that you can perm topicality, that people call it a perm, I don't really.
In that specific instance, like, or
But
that example.
that is
specifically.
that is not necessarily the example in which you would do it, because it wouldn't change it wouldn't change anything about the topicality debate as it was being evaluated, because the negative was still saying, has to be this, it has to be aid workers, and the fact that, well, it can't be both, the negative will come back, no, it has to be aid workers, and we'll be trying to win the standards debate, why that is the more appropriate definition. So if the negative team is still able to win that their definition of humanitarian aid being physical goods or aid workers,
But in reality, it could literally be both, right? I mean, not like one's more real than the other, but it could literally, human aid can be in the form of money or in the form of human aid, physical workers or volunteers or whatever.
we'll talk a little bit on the standards debate about this, but a lot of the reasons that you get into that is there are field contextual definitions of humanitarian aid, and so they're,
Depends on which one you're going with.
yeah, and
Okay.
so that's kind of that would be the counter interpretation that the negative team would run. They would say humanitarian aid can be both of these, here's another field contextual reason, or here's another reason why it would be better to have this as a good thing. And so that would be answering topicality, it would not really be a permutation though.
Oh,
But yeah, that is exactly the right type of argument that you're wanting to make in that situation. It's just not a permutation, but we'll get into what it's called.
okay.
Did you run a critique on T?
Yeah, and it can be done, it was done a lot a few years ago, and it's not as common anymore. A lot of times people think it's still losing battles strategically because you are kind of all putting all your eggs in one basket, and you have to devote time to running the argument and winning it. And does that mean you're just not gonna answer topicality at all? And, cause then if you don't answer topicality and you lose the critique of topicality, then topicality was conceded and you're not topical when you lose the debate. But if you have to run the critique of topicality and have to devote the time to answering topicality sufficiently to not, be putting all your eggs in the one basket of the critique of topicality, it's a lot of time devotion that might not, and the MG is really time crunch speech and difficult to do. So it's quite common, not very common, but you definitely see it, and it can be a good strategic option for you if you feel more comfortable answering it that way. A lot of people like it because teams like to get MG offense and new things that they can talk about, and if that's kind of the type of thing you like to do in the MG, it's definitely a good strategic, viable option.
Would the 25 example unsubstantial, would 25% then be the bright line?
That would be a bright line, yeah. The problem with those is the bright line is arbitrary, and so,
Why?
because you're not gonna find anything that says substantial is 25%, you don't look up the dictionary, the word substantial is 25% of, there's nothing that clearly defines it, and so why didn't they say 50%, or why doesn't it have to be 40 or 10? What is enough, and why? There's not any real reason to say that substantial is definitely this over this, and so it's hard to get a real definitive reason why your interpretation would be much better than another. Even if they do something really small, it's difficult to say, well, 10% is the appropriate bright line for this, and that arbitrary nature makes those distinctions kind of difficult.
Is bright line like limit, is that what it is?
It's, bright line is not really limits, is more a standard that we'll talk about in a little bit. Bright line is just the clear delineation. It's the point at which everything everything on this side of the line is topical, everything that is not that is not topical, and trying to be, so that is a perfect example of a bright line must be bright and clear, but also have good logical reasoning behind it, that being the difficulty with substantial, because there's not a real, even though you definitely have a very clear bright line, if your interpretation is 25% or something, you don't have a really specific reason about why it should be 25%. So not just bright line necessary, it needs to be a good logical one. That's what the standards debate is for, is why your specific reasoning and interpretation is best. So the interpretation and violation go together. The standards debate is, this is what you win topicality on. It's the interpretation and violation is setting up the game. It's explaining what sides. We're saying this, they're saying this. The standards debate is, here's why our version is better. Very simple. Usually, these take issues of fairness or education are the impacts that you go toward on the standards debate. I always tell people, like when they're constructing a PMC, for example, or just any case advantage, to kind of think backwards, think about the impact that you want to claim, and understand how you're going to construct your arguments to create a logical flow to get to the argument that you're going to be winning on. You feel like, I want to win this debate on Advantage 1, Russia relations, so I know that I'm going to have to connect my plan to getting Russian relations, and need to construct a uniqueness and internal link scenario that's going to make that happen. I think a similar thing is done on the standards debate, where we're going to win this debate because their interpretation is not predictable, or they take a lot of ground, or they are extra topical, or one of many different things, but you can kind of understand and logically think, hey, it's kind of unpredictable, or man, it seems like that explodes their ground, or something like that. There's way more different things that they can run now, and just taking that gut reaction and turning that into, okay, if that's the argument I want to claim, let's construct the standards to go ahead and get there. So the most common standards that you'll see are ground and predictability, and really are kind of all the same thing, predictable ground, because every ground loss is the standard, and it's usually what happens is people will list specific cases or instances or positions that they can't run, because of the fact that the plan didn't meet the interpretation. So because of the fact that the plan was only money, we had a disadvantage about humanitarian aid workers potentially being assaulted or something, and we don't get to have that that disadvantage, and about all the backlash that would be associated with any potential violence on aid workers because they only send money. That's an advantage that we should get. So, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you, but let's say someone's written like 2 topicalities, and then they read their standards, and then they say extend across my standards on the first topicality to like this topicality. How, like, does that apply if they're reading it on 2 different things?
I mean, it probably doesn't. Like, if they could extend across if they have an impact as to why predictable ground is important, they can extend across that impact, but they need to have a warrant on the second topicality as to why their interpretation is predictable, and this is in the second topicality as well as in the first one, because it doesn't matter if, yes, predictable ground would be important, but if you don't have an argument about why your interpretation accesses the most predictable ground, then it's not really worthwhile. So ground loss is, again, just positions often that can't be run, or sometimes it's, the plan is counterplan ground is something that you'll hear a lot, that if the resolution is something about the United States federal government should limit the use of some chemical, and the plan bans it. There might be a topicality saying limit means reduce but not ban, and the plan is counterplan ground, that the plan, we should be able to say ban as an alternative to your limited regulation, which is the ground assigned to you by the resolution. That might be an example of how you would say that the plan is counterplan ground. But again, it's great, every interpretation, by definition of being an interpretation, will limit ground. There will be ground loss on every interpretation because it's saying certain things are topical. By defining humanitarian aid that way, I can, send trying food or something, but
Which is also important.
yeah, or I can't send clowns, or something completely random, but there's no reason that anyone would have to think that would be something that would be included in humanitarian aid. So the fact that I lost my clowns disad, well, why would you have done that? Because nobody would do that because that's not predictable. Maybe that wasn't clear. The only point I was making is that there can be ground loss in anything, but you have to have a reason via the predictability standard of why your ground loss is something, why the ground that you're talking about is something that you should have, that the resolutions, because the resolution says this, we should be able to run this argument because humanitarian aid means this. We don't because you only send money, that's why. So predictable, so ground, a list of positions lost isn't sufficient in order to win topicality. You need also a warrant as to why the ground that you're listing off is ground that you should have based upon your interpretation of the resolution.
Like, what does it mean when someone says, like, we don't have a plan to this topic? Like, I know predictability is like we couldn't predict it, right, because it wasn't in the, whatever.
It would be, so if the United States should take military action against China, and the plan kinda, sends some military doctors to treat some Chinese peasants or something and give them all lollipops, and yeah, it's taking military action, but the ground standard, if you were running a topicality saying that's not military action against China, the ground would be, we had a disad about China backlashing and going to war, they're not going to do that because the plan only sends doctors and is not actually taking military action against China. So of course it won't lead to a giant conflict and war. So our China war disad is ground that we've lost based on the fact that you have violated our interpretation of the resolution. That military action against China is an aggressive, using bombs or something, or troops on the ground or what have you. I can't think of a perfect definition off the top of my head, but it certainly would not be sending doctors. Does that make sense?
Okay, so more into the whole specifics with topicality. I'm just gonna go back to the humanitarian aid thing, cause I capture that, I get that. So, if someone's like, wanted to run topicality on what humanitarian aid meant, and someone said, or let's say the app, whatever, says that it's, when we say that, what we're talking about is military supplies, anything has to do with military, offense or defense, or military stuff. And then so they respond to that saying, no, we actually think that military supplies means, food and people, volunteers, and, medicine. So is it like the app has to stick to like their point, how like it's only military supplies, or?
We'll get to that in a little bit. Not really, no. It depends how specific they are in the PMC. And that's kind of in many ways a reason to not be that specific in the PMC, because you don't want to necessarily pin yourself down
But
to
in
something if you don't
topicality,
have
don't
to.
you have to be specific? That's the whole point.
Yeah, but you have to
Choosing
in the
them.
MG. You don't necessarily have to read that at the top of the PMC,
Got it.
and you're beholden to that once you've done it. Like, once you say our interpretation of this word it's pretty hard to come up and provide a different counter interpretation in the MG, and it might turn out that there's a better counter interpretation that you can kind of tailor more specifically to their specific interpretation to
Yeah.
get a better strategic advantage, and so there's no point in playing that card before you need to. So unpredictability, this is in my mind the standard that is where topicality debates are won. The way I always ran it and it was quite successful doing this way, because I think what you need to do is say we have 2 or 3 warrants for why we have the most predictable interpretation, 1, 2, 3, and then we have this 1 or 2 points of impacts about why predictable ground is an important standard. I think that generally the type of warrants that you want to include, the best is if you can find something feel contextual. So in that instance, probably the United States government does have an official definition of what humanitarian aid is. The Department of State probably has this is humanitarian aid, and you can use their definition and say, Department of State
Official
says
as it gets.
it has to be physical good, gift of goods, or aid workers, or something along those lines, and doesn't say anything about money. I don't know if that's true or not. This is just an example. So if you find something that from an official source that, or a journal or something, an academic journal that defines humanitarian aid. If you can find a foreign policy article or something along those lines, it very much helps your case. That's in my mind, the best argument that you can get. It's the trump card, that you can say what you want to say about why your interpretation is better, but we've got the people who make the laws, their definition, they say it's this, that's the one that is going to be the most important. You'll also hear literature base that's kind of related to field context, that in the academic literature on international relations and foreign policy, humanitarian aid is distinctly classified as separate from monetary donations, and you find some academic journal or source that says such a thing, and that's what it's great to use prep time for, is we think they might be kind of non-topical in this way. If they only do money, that's gonna hurt us, we're not gonna get access to this. We're gonna run we're gonna prep a topicality in case they only send money. And if they send money, I'm gonna need a field contextual warrant for why it has to be goods. And you can go, I wonder what the Department of State, and you can say, US government defines humanitarian aid as in Google. And boom, there's so many rounds that you can win as learning to logically just Google and try and find how some government agency defines the question in the same way that you are defining it.
So when you go into a round and like say you were expecting like that humanitarian aid people or something, but then you have that locality and you have like that disadvantage, would you still run that disadvantage on the off chance that you would win T, or would you just like throw it out completely?
It depends. There are some judges who say that there has to be proven abuse in order to vote on topicality, meaning that in that case it would be, the proven abuse would be you running the disadvantage. Then in the MG, the government team saying, no link, we don't send people, we only send money. And then in the MO you would say, see, that's proven abuse. They have no link to our disadvantage by virtue of the fact they don't meet our interpretation. That's kind of not as commonly expected anymore for you to actually run the position, but you'll still see it a fair amount depending on the circuit you're in, so your coaches will probably know more tailored to your area. And then there are some times where you're protecting against the no link, where you think they might try to be squirrely and weasel out of your disadvantage. So you run a quick topicality saying, hey, we define it like this, they can't do anything, and try and link out saying it's not that. And so it kind of puts pressure on them that they don't want to, they could have got away with no linking the disad and being squirrely in the MG, but you protected yourself by running topicality, so they don't want to run the risk of. And so in that instance, if you kind of run a quick topicality to protect your link, a lot of times they say, yeah, we're not going to no link your disad, we're meeting your interpretation, we're doing that, we're fine. And you'll see that sometimes, but for the most part, it's not necessarily required to run the disad.
But if you don't like, I don't know, say you didn't prep out enough, like you just prep that way, like would it be okay to still use it?
It can depend. I mean, there's some times where it's so blatant that it would certainly doesn't have anything to do with it. Like if it's dependent on, if it's about there being attacks on aid workers and there being a big international backlash because of the attacks on aid workers and they only send money, there's not really any possibility that there's anything related to it. So I would try and, wing it, going for other stuff. It's, but there are times when your link will be based off of, oh, somebody gets mad and your interpretation says that the plan has to be more aggressive than it is, or something like that. And so your link would be stronger if their plan was more aggressive, right? And
Right.
people would backlash a lot more if the plan was really strong and forward. But if it's just kind of this small policy that no one really cares about and it's not that impactful in the scheme of things, then your link won't be as strong. In that instance, you might still want to run the disad, because it still could piss somebody off. There still could be a risk of a backlash in that scenario. It just wouldn't be as strong of a risk as it would be if they had been more aggressive as per your interpretation. So it kind of depends on the situation, but if it's clear that, okay, our interpretation, they have to do this and they are in no way doing that, then there's no way that you'll trip the link of there being attacks on aid workers, because there aren't going to be any. There's no point in going for that. Predictability, literature-based and field context are what you hope for. A lot of times you need to have done that before the round, because they read something and it's caught you off guard and you can't bring out your phone and Google to find the contextual definition or something. That's not allowed. So what do you do when you don't have that? Some people make it up. That's not, you should not make up field contextual definitions. But in that case, grammar is something that you'll often see used as an interpretation, so it's kind of parsing, or as a standard, excuse me. So parsing the interpretation to say, this is what it's really asking us to do, directly modifying something instead of, indirectly trying to affect it. Basically saying, getting down to the nitty-gritty of what exactly the resolution is saying. I don't know why people call it grammar. It's really just a more specific, this word means this, and they just tag it grammar for some reason. But it's the standard and tag that you'll see used a lot.
So when does it where do you go? Like for an example, like I was telling Ola that I was in a class and they were talking about topicality. And one of the things was the United States federal government should invest in green cars. And it was like the whole thing about what is green car? Like, okay, look, paint a car green, you know? Another one was like, oh, it's made out of like plants and grass, you know? Like, because all these were literally and then obviously there's green cars like that we know, eco-friendly or whatever. So like for something like that, like green, and green, they're all like fantastic definitions. So like what do you do when we get caught up in that? Like, we just duke it out, like what does green really mean, like 40 minutes, or when do you actually go to the real stuff?
In that instance, you don't even need, that's where the literature base would be the appropriate standard to use. Nobody's talking about investing in painting cars green.
Well, what if someone like, I don't know.
So what you're
Those are
saying.
a great example though to get like how.
Yeah, and so, but the literature base is the argument that is important there, because if you Google green cars, you're gonna find a hell of a lot about hybrid technology and electric cars and various things. There will not be, you might see something about cars painted green, but not about the US federal government investing in painting cars green, buying a bunch of them, or something like along those lines, so. The literature base of what green cars means is ecologically friendly automobiles, and that is a stronger, that is an interpretation that is more based in the literature than is their which is painting cars green or buying green cars.
Or cars made out of
Yeah.
paint made from grass. That was another thing noted.
Yeah.
Sorry. How do you win topicality?
You win topicality by
Having a better definition?
having a better definition, but you win topicality by winning the predictability standard in my eyes. And so it starts off with, here are a few warrants for why we're the most predictable. A, it's field contextual. The Department of State uses our definition of humanitarian aid. B, it's more based in the literature, blah, blah, blah. Here's why predictable ground is important. And then you read the impacts to the standards. And that's the thing I think that gets missed in debate, in topicality debates, is people read a bunch of stuff, why their interpretation is more predictable, or why there's lost, or something along those lines, but they don't take it to the next step of saying what happens in those situations what is the effect of predictable ground. And I was bad at most things in debate, but I was really good at topicality, and it was because I really sat on it and went for it. And judges don't like voting on predictable ground, and they'll tell you, or stuff like, oh, there's prep abuse, and judges will tell you that they hate voting on stuff like that because it's wishy-washy and vague. They will not hate prep abuse arguments if you spend 20 seconds or 15 seconds explaining, okay, when they don't do that, they have 20 minutes to prep specific warrants and detailed analysis for all of this. We don't have any time to come up with a response, so everything we're doing is off the fly. We don't have any ability to research specifics. Everything has to be in our brain. They get 20 minutes of Google, we get none. But we also only have the most generic, predictable responses because we're coming up with them off the top of our heads. So they spend, 5 minutes of prep writing responses to the very predictable, generic strategies against it. And so not only do they have 20 minutes of ability to research more specifics, they also have front lines to the stuff that you're coming up with off the top of your head. You would want to be more concise than that in explaining it in actual debate. Don't want to spend 45 seconds or a minute actually talking about that, but explaining that in 15 seconds will win you a lot of debates, because people understand that, and it really makes sense when you're like, the judge is looking at, the advantage 2, the econ, and there are like 3 specific warrants about how the plan that nobody saw coming is what's necessary to, like boom, boom, boom. It's like, oh, they're really good arguments. Do not know. And the responses that the LO makes are generic and, not as applicable to the specific plan because they're coming up with them off the top of their head because there's no way in hell that they should have predicted those. And so impacting the predictability standard is the thing that does not get done enough in topicality, and it's the thing that will allow you to win topicality debates way more than most people, because people don't go there. If you provide 2 or 3 warrants why you're the most predictable, and you provide 10 to 15 seconds of explanation of why predictability is a very important standard. I did it for 2 years. Nobody ever answered with as much as I put it. There was not a team who came back with no, or I don't rarely think if I read 3 warrants for why we're the most predictable, a team ever answered all 3. Like rarely ever. People don't go to that level of specificity on it, and it can be difficult to do that. You have to be concise, and if you're not, then you're spending way too much time on topicality, and it can be a bad strategic move, even if it does make. So I'm not saying go crazy on it, but getting good at providing a lot more depth on the predictability standard will allow you to win way more topicality debates than everybody else, because people don't go as deep as you do, if you go that deep. Other standards that you'll see, I didn't write it up there, but there's limits. What time is it? Oh shit, I gotta hurry up. Limits just basically means, it's saying under their interpretation of the resolution, almost anything could be topical. So there could be hundreds of topical cases, whereas our interpretation of humanitarian aid that has to be aid workers or something means there's only a small number of topical cases that equalizes prep. It's kind of, in my eyes, a subset of the predictability standard. It's just a warrant for why your interpretation is better for predictable ground than their interpretation is, because your interpretation more appropriately limits the number of topical cases. So that'll often be read as its own standard. In my eyes, it is kind of just a warrant for predictability. Other standard, the main one you'll see other than those, and it's a little bit of a different animal just because it's not necessarily explicitly based in fairness-based impacts. It is topic-specific education, or just education in general. this is, in my eyes, and also kind of an underutilized aspect. I think the problem when people debate topic-specific education, they say, our interpretation is better for more topic-specific education. And then they kind of just repeat that, and their warrant is kind of just, because we are talking about this topic, or we're going in more detail, but there's not a lot of specifics that they're going into. And so highlighting examples of things that are not included in the discussion, that green cars is also a perfect example, that we're not learning anything about relevant issues under your interpretation, because nobody cares about the green car color of the car industry. Like, that's not, nobody cares about that, but there is a lot of educational debate to be had, and a lot to learn in a debate about green cars, ecologically friendly cars, and government promotion thereof. So that interpretation is bad for topic-specific education because nobody cares about the color of the car. That goes into the voting issues, and when I say that goes into the voting issues, it's because usually you'll see two, fairness in education and little digression on that. Often it starts with a priori or something along those lines, that it's a gateway issue. Essentially, this is just stating that you need to look to topicality or issues of fairness or education first in the debate round before you evaluate the rest of the debate. So the team has to be topical in order to even consider whether, it doesn't matter if the advantages are better than the disadvantages, because you evaluate topicality first. And then usually it's a priori for reasons of fairness or education. And fairness being, a lot of times people don't need you to provide a warrant for that. Some judges will just say that, yeah, if you win their interpretation is more unfair, you're gonna win topicality. Others will require you to just go a little bit in depth. It's not that important though, and I wanna get on the counter-interpretation stuff, so we'll just skip over that. Fairness in education, most people do it in the debate anyway. I kind of think it's a bad idea to just say, this is a voting issue, a priori, for fairness in education. But I feel like 70–80% of the topicality shells you see, people do that, and it's rare to get called on, so there's more to learn there if you want to go more in depth, but in the interest of time, we'll move on. That's how you run topicality: interpretation, violation, standards, voters. The interp and violation are together. They are, here's what we are, here's what they are, here's how they're not what we say they should be. The standards is, here's why we're better than them. The voters is, here's why us being better than them means that we should win the debate. Very simple. Answering topicality. The first thing about answering topicality, if you do not have a counter-interpretation, you are doing it wrong. You have to. It's one of the biggest mistakes that people make, is not providing counter-interpretation when they're learning. And that's because
What if you didn't prep for that?
What?
What if you didn't prep for that? Like, you didn't know that they were gonna like say what humanitarian efforts really meant, like.
And so your counter-interpretation would be something that humanitarian aid includes aid workers, physical goods, and monetary assistance is your counter-interpretation, because you're given money.
Everything that they said, everything that they're not, basically, or what?
No, just like they say it's only aid workers or physical goods, you say it can be aid workers, physical goods, or monetary assistance, and you're giving them money, so you meet your counter-interpretation, because you are giving money, and under that definition or interpretation of humanitarian aid, you meet that, and so
you're kind of
your
saying,
argument.
yeah, you're right, but we're more right,
Yeah.
basically, right?
Counter-interpretation is, okay, you said that's what, the interpretation is, this is how it should be, the negative saying that. The counter-interpretation is the affirmative saying, no, it should be this. And it's just basically providing a competing definition or explanation of the word or concept that you are talking about of humanitarian aid. You say it's this, we say it includes monetary assistance as part of humanitarian aid. So we meet that counter interpretation, and then your counter standards would then be reasons why monetary assistance, a definition of humanitarian aid that includes monetary assistance is better than their
One that
definition.
doesn't.
Yeah. So you also want an explanation of how you meet your counter interpretation. So a counter interp, and then we meet the counter interp. That's basically just explaining how your plan does meet the definition provided in the counter interpretation. So in that example, the we meet to the counter interpretation would be plan gives money that is included in our counter interpretation of humanitarian aid as including monetary assistance. So we meet the counter interpretation. Very simple, but something you just kind of gotta include to, just make everything clear. Then you will have the counter standards, and it's the reasons why your standards, it's equivalent to disads. Like if, just in like a debate, one team runs advantages, one team comes up and runs disadvantages. Counter standards are the disadvantages, or the advantages to the net benefits to your counter plan or counter interpretation in this instance. So they're very analogous in that way. But in this example, might be that, say you can come up with another thing off the top of your head that, and this is something that to be good at topicality, you have to be doing some work and prep of thinking about, are we gonna run into any trouble on topicality with these things? And we're, okay, in this example, we're giving money for humanitarian aid. Do you think they might run topicality on that? It's a possibility that they could do that. So let's try and find something that'll support our definition, or a example of, well, this was called humanitarian aid and it just was giving money. So part of being good at topicality is predicting when topicality might be run on you and having the foresight to understand that that's coming and protect against it and prep to think about it, to have something ready to go. But if you don't have that, if you didn't do that in prep time, you might also say, your interpretation overly limits, it makes it a very small number of potential topical cases, and the affirmative needs flexibility to combat negative side bias or something along those lines. So you can kind of come up with stuff, even if you don't have anything prepped at all, you do know that your interpretation, or that their interpretation is more limiting than yours, right? Because their interpretation says it can only be this, 2 things. Your says it can be 3 things. So you know that there's greater possibility for flexibility, and if you can think of a warrant for why affirmative flexibility is good, then that's an impact, and you can weigh that as a net benefit to your counter interpretation.
Can 2 of your 3 things, because you just said they can say 2 things, you can say 3 things, can 2 of your 3 things be both of theirs?
Yeah.
So then what would someone else say? Because obviously if someone was saying like, humanitarian aid is money and medical supplies, and you're like, it's money, medical supplies, and, workers or people, volunteers, how would the people, obviously they have more to go with, they are including everything you are, what could you say? So what would that person, what would the first team argue then? Well, no, humans aren't good. What are they gonna say? You know what I'm saying?
I think that's just the arguments about, that's evaluated on the standards debate via the question of, it would be better to say it's only physical goods because of this, and you wouldn't want to include, so if you have a field contextual warrant or something like Department of State says humanitarian aid's this, that's why you would prefer yours. If they just start including some random stuff here or there, there's no reason to just, and a bunch of other people too, if they're not included in the plan text, you know, if we say, no, it's monetary assistance and it's 5 other things that we don't have anything to do with, what's the point of even bringing them into the conversation in your counter interpretation? So you don't need to just add a bunch of stuff if it's not going to be directly relevant or implicated in the question, and this specific instance of, well, the question becomes, does monetary assistance count as humanitarian aid? So it doesn't really matter to include a bunch of other things in the counter interpretation or your interpretation that would not be included within that. And it can only hurt you, because if you say, and workers and economic aid, and even though your plan doesn't actually, if you just say like, trying to think of an example, still in the humanitarian aid, that I haven't come up with a whole new one. And who needs these? But yeah, essentially that's all evaluated via the standards debate of, yeah, they could say that, and you could say that, but the standards debate is why the thing that we've picked is going to be our interpretation of how it should be, is it the most beneficial. So even if they come out with something that should be this, should be this, we're winning our standards. They can say a bunch of whatever they want in the counter interpretation, we're winning the standard, so we win the debate. At the end of the day, in order to be a good topicality debater, you need to be able to isolate the argument you're winning, the standard you're winning, and you need to be able to explain why that standard is more important than any other standards.
Like the warrants, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you'll always be winning something. Every interpretation will have a standard going for it. Might be a shitty standard, but like, it might be an incredibly unfair interpretation where there's only one topical case and it's a really bad topical case, really unfair for the affirmative. But if you include a bunch of warrants about why affirmative has this huge bias, and you could try it, you know, counteract that, you can find something in any interpretation, and in that instance, you said half-side bias is really strong, the negative needs resolutions that are very limiting and binding on the government in order to be able to compete with that. You can try and leverage that into something, you know, so every interpretation will have a standard that it's winning, and if you get good at explaining why, at isolating whatever that standard is, and providing specific, or providing analysis about why that standard is more important than all the other ones, you'll win. Probably over time, but
Yeah.
anyone, quick questions or?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.